Too late, it's over. Okay, as you know, tonight we have Fred Fisher. Fred is one of the youngest in the group, I guess along with Mike Rotundi, my partner, at 30 years old. And I think it's important, it was for me, in looking at the series, that the age represents another kind of diversity of this kind of a group. And it's, I think, important that a person of that age can do this kind of quality of work and this amount of work and be shown with people like Roland Coate and Frank Gehry, who've been practicing for a while. It's interesting to me in that he's been connected to a lot of people in this series, more than most, I guess, and that he studied at UCLA with Hodgetts and Howard and Kupper and Mangurian, and he's worked with Frank Gehry, so he has a lot of connections with other people in this series. His work, like a lot of the work you've been seeing, has been shown fairly extensively. Leica, Cooper Hewitt, the New American Show in Rome, Milan, and Venice, etc., and the at Gallery in Stuttgart. He's working currently with Thane Roberts, and he's going to be discussing tonight architecture in Big Pink.
Is that wrong preposition?
What?
Wrong preposition. Two. We'll just go like. I couldn't believe it. I got here tonight and somebody was in my parking space. Okay. It's, I think, fortunate that I'm presenting tonight. For some strange reason, I, as rarely happens, was at the first lecture, second lecture, I guess, late, a few minutes late. And I walked in and I had a standing, I had to stand over there pretty close to the door, and I couldn't see too well. But I was lucky in that in front of me was the television monitor, and the television camera was pointed right on the speaker, and a little tiny TV screen, behind the monitor, which would allow me to see what I couldn't see up in front. And in the monitor was the Orioles beating the Pirates in the third game. So, unless there's a better movie on tonight, I'll have a little more attention, I guess. Tom's point about the people I've been connected with is important to me too, and I owe a great deal to those people that he mentioned that I studied with, and especially to Frank Gehry, who I worked my ass off for 2 years for. Learned an incredible amount. To begin with, I wanted to spell out a couple of models that I'll refer back to as I go through the work, and the presentation is going to be divided into two parts essentially. The name that I gave the Times for the announcement of this talk, they decided not to print. It was actually the title of that was supposed to be Fisher Offers Double Talk, and you can decide for yourself later about that. But it is a double talk. The first part is essentially theoretical, speculative work that. Although I would fully appreciate and be willing to build any of it, it's essentially intended really to explore ideas rather than respond to a particular client. The second section is projects that were actually commissioned and so-called real projects, and one of which was built. Probably the most central aspect of my work that I'll be referring to is that of metaphor. And a metaphorical sign can be distinguished into three categories, and I have a predilection toward the first two. This is a model that I'm taking from Geoffrey Broadbent, and those three types of signs are index, icon, and symbol. An index is a direct manifestation of the object of the sign. And an example of that would be the way a shadow is a manifestation of the sun, so that you could say a shadow is an index of the sun. Secondly is an icon. An icon bears some kind of formal correspondence to the object. And as such, there's while not the same intimate connection as an index, it's fairly easy for one to figure out an iconic sign because there's a formal connection. An example of that would be, you could say, a yellow circle is a symbol, an iconic symbol for the sun. The last kind is, an iconic sign. The last kind is a symbol, or a symbolic sign, and in that, only by cultural convention is there a connection between the sign and the object. The word sun, S-U-N, bears no formal or any other kind of connection to the actual phenomena of the sun, and it's only by speaking the same language do any of us know that those three letters have anything to do with the sun. So that's the most remote connection of the types of signs. Okay. The next concept I want to talk about before I show any of the work is that of microcosm. And actually, in preparing this lecture was an opportunity I much appreciate for taking some time out to think out my own work, and it was a fairly difficult process that ended about a half hour ago when I started shoving slides into the carousel. For some reason, well, it's actually fairly obvious. The natural universe is much too subtle and complex for us really to comprehend. And so rather than essentially letting it go, as is generally done or attempted to be done in Eastern thought, Western thought tends to model the universe and simplify it and abstract it in a way that makes it more comprehensible to us, and then pass those models on in the culture. And so by understanding a microcosm about the world, we can then relax about it a little bit and say, okay, I really understand what the structure of things is, and I don't have to worry about it. It's not a chaos that we're just swimming through. We have a handle on it. The scale of microcosm is fairly significant, and as it relates to architecture, we're rather fortunate in that we happen to be dealing with a medium that, to me, is opportune for the creation of microcosm. Architecture is of a human scale. We inhabit it, and it forms a context for human activities and within human time, which is important. Could I have the first slide? Wrong carousel. This I didn't touch it. Okay. It's the other carousel. Okay. Okay. This is a piece by Joseph Cornell. Thank you. Who was a master at a certain type of microcosm, and in it he created a number of different kinds of worlds. And in making microcosm, what is left out is, of course, just as important as what's brought in. The selectivity works both ways. Vitruvius was interested in that concept as well, and for him, the body and the building were a macrocosm of the world. And in this diagram, not his, of course, but on his concepts, shows the way the body generates, is really seen as the generator of symmetry in architecture, in that the human body, like any other animal, is symmetrical about the axis of movement. And really the foundation for symmetry in architecture is just about that simple. It's architecture being then a macrocosm for the body, and the two being a microcosm of the universe. The content of the microcosm that I'm going to be dealing with in a few cases is cosmological. Cosmology tends to ask two questions. The first is, where are we? And the second is, what time is it? In order to understand our place in nature, which is essentially a continuum, we need a cosmology that will isolate us and structure our relationship to the rest of nature. And the same way with time being a continuity, but that doesn't do us any good. In order for time to be useful to us, it has to be broken into parts that relate to our lives, that go from anywhere from a moment to a month, to a year, to a life, to an age. And so both those aspects of cosmology are directly applicable in our conception of where we are in the universe, and in what time we're moving through the universe. This is a project for a solar crematory that I did at a time I was involved with a group that was the Interdisciplinary Group for Ecology, Development, and Energy. And they were working on new concepts for energy use. And at the same time, I was exposed to our culture's treatment of the institution of death, which is fairly inadequate in comparison to a lot of other contemporary cultures, or especially cultures in the past. The project attempted to use the architecture to create a microcosm that would be activated by the ritual of using the crematory. The plan is a very simple icon, starting with the symmetry of the body and the Vitruvian diagram of the circle and the square, the fundamental Platonic shapes, also corresponding to the Chinese symbols for the earth being the square and the heavens being the circle. The circle was a berm which formed a local horizon, which made it a virtual microcosm as well as a conceptual microcosm. When one was within the complex, your vision was delineated by this intimate horizon. The procession through the crematory was along the axis of the world, the north-south axis, starting from the left, moving through a forest of heliostat mirrors and into the central rotunda, which was a further miniaturization of that model of the that icon of the universe. The rotunda reveals itself in plan, section, and elevation as essentially the same formal idea. The dome representing the heavens above, the square enclosure, the earth, and the tile pattern on the floor, the waters. Finally, the procession moves up to the building that houses the cremator. It essentially sits as a boat in a pond, and at this point, this is a cutaway of the actual furnace inside. The charge is then placed in the furnace, still following on the same axis, and it's reduced to ashes by a concentration of light. There was a total eclipse of the sun last February that passed over the northern United States, the last one this century, and the eclipse was on a Monday morning, and I wanted to go and wasn't really sure how I would be able to do that. And so there's a general contractor that lives near me and that I have breakfast with occasionally when I can get up early enough. And I called him up about 7 o'clock Saturday night and asked him if he'd be interested in driving a round trip of 3,000 miles for a 2-minute event that, because of the weather, there was probably only a 30% chance of seeing it all. And could we use his car? He said, "Okay, I'll be over in 2 hours." And he did, and we drove up and saw the eclipse and turned around and drove back. And it was spectacular, to say the least. And it wasn't until I began working on this talk and trying to figure out why I did that that I understood what it was about natural phenomena that is distinct from abstractions, and that is the element of time. What happens during an eclipse is that the world stays full scale. The horizon is just as big as it always is. You can see mountains 50 miles away this way and 50 miles away that way. And it was clear being in the middle of the winter. But independent of the scale of the environment, the time is contracted so that a cycle of the day from sunrise to sunset all of a sudden happens in 2 minutes. Essentially the same visual phenomena. And that, as I understand that, it really means that time is the fundamental aspect of nature, in that in order for any natural object to grow, move, or decay, the element of time has to be present. So I did a couple of speculative projects that deal with those ideas, and also my casual interest in astronomy. One of which is a bath located in the desert. A solar panel heats the water during the daytime, and then one would go out at night and ascend the stairs to this little platform that had would then have a pool of hot water in it. Fairly simple device. When in this water and looking at the sky, you would be presented with the universe as really a context of total flux and lack of structure. There's no image to the sky. It's like a fugue, and or in more contemporary terms, if you compare Brian Eno's ambient music for airports to, say, the Beatles' White Album, one is done with particular forms, the Beatles album, and one is a field of music with essentially continually sliding relationships that are never fixed, the ambient music. This also establishes a relationship between the remote stars and the intimacy of one of our natural elements, which is the water that would be around the body. In contrast to this project, which essentially presents you with a total lack of structure, the next observatory project was attempted at establishing an absolute fix, or the ultimate structure. This being what you might say would be the field of the sky, and in order the process of modeling that I talked about earlier is present in that if traditional thought has to import these images of the bear and the dipper and that on the sky, and contemporary thought imposes a radial framework on the sky, and in order to attempt to conceive of it, if you erase all of those things, you see the sky as it is. What you're seeing is a totally dynamic and essentially structurable relationship. What makes that unstructurable is that there is a phenomenon called the precession of the equinox, which is a 27,000-year cycle that the axis of the Earth goes through. And obviously, since it takes 27,000 years, it takes a long time to figure out that cycle even exists. This is the temple at Luxor, and the Egyptians were very good astronomers, and they got into, for their own survival, an index for the coming of the flooding of the Nile, which was what's called the heliacal rising of the star Sirius. And heliacal rising is a point at which, essentially all the stars are out all the time. It's just that we can't see them during the daytime because the sun's light is too bright. But as the sun moves through the sky, and it exposes new stars all the time on the morning horizon, and the first day that a star is exposed on that horizon is called an heliacal rising. It just so happened that the heliacal rising every year of the star Sirius indicated by a specific number of days the flooding of the Nile. So since that really had very fundamental consequences to them, these massive structures were erected to index that event. But as you can see, what happened was that that's not a fixed event. And over the time it took to build these things, which is an incredibly long time, by the time they get out to here, it wasn't quite working anymore. So they had to cant the whole thing a little bit. And then by the time they got out here, it still wasn't working again. So they had to cant the whole thing again. And the most frustrating thing of all would be had they gone on until the star finally stopped migrating on the horizon, then the damn thing would have started to slide back. And so that, you know, essentially you would get a serpentine structure attempting to follow this specific event. But anyway, that was supposedly an absolute event, but it turned out that the large-scale cycle made that, even that relative. The problem then is that of accuracy. Architecture is basically just too gross and too immobile, really, to index these kinds of events. But there is one index that can be made that is an absolute, and that is the inclination of the axis of the Earth itself. And if one looks in a direction of the axis of the Earth, you see not, you just so happen to see the North Star right now, which is not exactly on that axis, but very, very close. You see a location in the sky that never moves. And it's the only absolute relationship the Earth has to the rest of the cosmos. And this is a diagram of that. That phenomena, that tilt of the Earth's axis, is called the obliquity of the ecliptic. And the ecliptic is the path that the Earth takes around the sun. And the obliquity is the obliqueness that the Earth has to that axis as it spins on its axis, and that's 23 degrees, 27 minutes. And so this is the axis of the Earth rotating at that 23 degrees, 27 minutes, and then this whole axis then moves through a similar 23 degrees, 27 minute cycle. And this is what takes 27,000 years, is for this tilt to move all the way around in a circle. And so the equinoxes, here, the intersection of the ecliptic and the equator, take that long to move around to the same position. Okay, so this is what happens if you look at the North Pole. You see, first of all, you see that the North Star is not at the North Pole. It's just off of it. It rotates in a tiny little circle around the North Pole. So the project is for an observatory. It was initially done in response to an invitation from the Kupper Museum of the Smithsonian Institution for what they called conceptual ideas for urban open space, and which is essentially a way of letting you do whatever you want and making it in some way related to open space. I thought that one of the greatest open space resources we have is on the area underground. And so this was an observatory that was predominantly underground. There were two small pavilions above the ground. This one, where one entered this long stairway, this is a perspective section, and descended eventually 90 feet into the earth, and to a series of chambers, one of which had the final one had a spring-fed pool in, and a pipe coming out of that chamber. And that pipe is tilted at the same angle as the latitude that this facility is built on, which directs your view along this pipe to the North Pole. Something like that. Cuts through the earth at about 400 feet and finally comes out at a tiny little pavilion a few hundred feet away from the other one, and points toward the North Star, or I'm sorry, the North Pole. It's long been a phenomena that's been discussed for a long time and never proven nor disproven, is that if you look through a long enough pipe, you'll be able to see stars during the daytime. And so this was predicated partially on that idea, and that you have a 400-foot long pipe, and so one could go down to this facility day or night and look at the North Pole, see the North Star rotating around it in a tiny little circle. And so the whole facility, although there's really only one way to use it, is essentially an index for this basic cosmological relationship of the Earth to the rest of the universe, the obliquity of the ecliptic. I got more involved with the element of time on a project that I did for my master's thesis. And the time in this project was manifested in two ways. One was immediate time, and one was historical time. What you see here is a manifestation of historical time in that architecture is essentially an ephemeral phenomenon, and it degrades over time, and has one character, has a different character under the effects of nature. And then the immediate time being the fact that the Inca were as an agricultural civilization, also had some important celestial indexes to make, and their most important one was the winter solstice sunrise, at which point the days stop getting shorter and they start getting longer, which means that spring is coming and they can start growing crops again and survive another year. Another aspect of this project was the association to architectural types. The construction that was done at Machu Picchu is essentially of two characters. There's the terracing used for the agriculture, and then there are these linear buildings that run parallel to the terraces as a series of walls and piers on which a light thatched structure was placed. This is about exactly full size of this drawing. The site for this hotel was a saddle similar to that which Machu Picchu sits in, about a mile away from the ruins and facing the ruins. So there's a gentle slope on the back and a sheer drop on the front of the site. The ruins being up at the top, a mile away. It just so happened that there was a coincidental alignment between the winter solstice sunrise, which is indicated by this blue line, tears right through the middle of the site and points at the ruins themselves. The two types of construction were picked up in the terraces, which wrapped around the shallow part of the slope, and then had a light membrane of glass over those that formed the housing. And then the public spaces were a spine along the top of the site as a set of stone piers and walls, which had a light metal shell wrapped over the top of it. The next concept I want to go over is that of naturalism. The building process has history. There's distinct manifestations through time, the foundation, the frame, the enclosure, and as the building degrades, this process, and the resultant forms are reversed. Within Western tradition, there's a set of ideas that appreciates this process. And in the 19th century, in the context of man controlling nature, the Romantic tradition developed, and especially in painting and landscape architecture, that had an outlook respecting the ephemeral quality of man and his works with respect to nature. So rather than opposing the traditional Western concept of man in total control of nature, supposedly impermanent, you have a concept of man as being relatively insignificant in relationship to nature. there's a set of natural forces that really that tend to make man's work and himself fairly ephemeral. And the local conditions we have here in Southern California, I think, really give much more substance to that concept. When one comes from Cleveland, Ohio, to an area that has earthquakes, fires, hillside fires and floods, I began to get a much more acute awareness of the way nature can essentially kick ass whenever. And at the time these ideas were coming together, I happened to get a so-called real job, and the real job is about 1 block away from where these photographs were taken. It's up in the Hollywood Hills. And it's for a very small house. The building is really seen as an index for the its own inevitable ruin, and an icon for the natural gradient, which is the strata of the Earth, the habitable zone in between and the sky above. The land is permanent, but the shelter is ephemeral. Because it's ephemeral, it has to be a real or made object rather than an abstraction. And because an abstraction is essentially timeless. And so this, I'm sorry if I could back up for a minute. This being the substructure of the building, a set of walls and slabs, in this case, being an icon, not only being an index for the natural processes of erosion, but also an icon for the strata of the Earth from which it comes. And the site model gives you the idea of the Earth as a sandwich, or and the building being constructed of masonry essentially takes on the same characteristic. The relatively permanent masonry structure below and the relatively impermanent wood structure above. The house takes on a cardinal alignment versus the incidental alignment of the local conditions. There's an existing structure here. This is a balcony, and that alignment is picked up in a deck at the edge of the site. This being a finger of land dropping off radically on 3 sides above sunset, and then the building and its access is cranked into the cardinal alignment, the north, south, east, west, this being north. And also being able to then pick up on such things as what recently happened when I was up there, the equinoctial sunset, which would then come right through a corridor in the building, here and here. Same for the sunrise. corresponding also to the city grid below, which, although the grid shifts all over in Los Angeles, in this area of town, it does, in fact, happen to be oriented with the cardinal points. And so this small building is then tied down into the fabric of the city as well as to the larger processes. This is the Griffith Observatory over here, and Roland and I were trying to figure out if we were building on the same site or not. The house also has the aspect of the primary abode that Palladio talked about. The basic trabeated construction of the house being the most basic architectural form. And on a site that radical and for a building that small, I felt that that was really the appropriate prototype to make. I don't really know how to make the transition to the next project, and so let's just call it an interlude and not try and make any great connection. There's a couple of young developers in Ocean Park that came to Thane and I and asked us if we would like to speculate on the typology of townhouses in Ocean Park. And, you know, sure, why not? So we, as quickly as we could, got into the hierarchy of values that you do on projects like that. And those are generally view, privacy, view, privacy, view, privacy, view, privacy. We decided to complicate the thing and add a few more issues. We thought that identity and communality were things that were significant in that type of development, and also association to local building types. So on this beautiful site in Ocean Park, we looked around at the local references, and wow, that was a shame. Came up with a scheme that started with a very regular stepped parking slab, three-tiered, stepping up the slope, and then put on it an irregular building footprint that formed a courtyard, but while maintaining the direct relationship between the parking stalls and each particular unit, which is now pretty significant to those things, allowing these to be carriage houses, so-called. And then even though the site was not all that large and the demands for square footage on it were large, we managed to squeeze a courtyard out of it, and which would then give a gradient of exposure being for local views, intimate views from each of the units into this courtyard, and then the remote views, each of the units out to the ocean, this direction. And also a gradient of privacy, a transition from the street through this pergola to the entry court, and then from the court transition through these stairs and porches to the units themselves, and finally to completely private decks and yards around the perimeter for each one of the units. The porches and stairs in the courtyard also animated in a way that's fairly common in Ocean Park, to have these exposed wooden staircases, you know, jumping off the sides of buildings. In massing, it was essentially a set of bungalows on top of a dingbat. And while getting the mass we needed for the first 2 levels, the bedrooms and living area, the unit identity was maintained on the top level with these little bungalows, and also the domestic association, so that the master suite of the master bedroom and bathroom was essentially its own house. We ran into some questions of marketability trying to market the unorthodox, which contributed to the termination of this project. This is also a so-called real project. It's a house that is generated really from three ideas. A set of metaphors, specifically a boat and a wave, an archetype, which is an atrium, and a concept of construction, which is that of a collage. The clients for this house conceived the original plan in a very diagrammatic form. It was a very clear plan. There's a central atrium, and then there's studios that bracket that atrium on either side, and then the other living area, the kitchen dining room areas between one of the studios and the atrium. And then on the second level, the atrium runs through with a gallery around it, master bedroom on one end, and secondary bedroom in the rear. Thane Roberts translated this into an initial plan, and then for reasons which he was probably, or which I'll never know, felt an irresistible urge to go to Canada, and was gracious enough to turn the project over to me. The project was designed while I was working, quote unquote, full time in the office of Frank Gehry, and I think that will be fairly obvious. There are obvious associations in character, construction, and formalism to Frank's work. I think there are equally obvious differences in imagery, content, metaphor, and also in other aspects of formalism. The basic image of the house is that the roof is a dual image. On the inside, it has the character of the hull of a boat, the exposed hull of a boat. Lori Caplin spent 14 years of her childhood on a boat in the Seine River, and while not verbalizing that as a specific intent, with an awareness of that and a coincidence with some other aspects of construction that I wanted to develop, that imagery was manifested in the roof. This being an inverted axonometric looking at the whole roof section. A fragment of what you see over there, full size. The other image is that of the atrium. Within the fabric of the house, this atrium is just sort of jammed in and I guess torn a bit to make sure that it's kept quite separate formally and conceptually from the rest of the house. It's seen as an ambiguous space that is either an interior court, an interior atrium, or an exterior court that's faced with a set of buildings. The ground level plan. The house is also bracketed by streets, one on San Juan on the south and Westminster on the north. The formal entry is on San Juan into this large hallway. The Laurie studio at this end. The hallway proceeds down, wraps around the atrium, and Lauren's studio in the rear. These areas being on the ground level, stepping up 18 inches to the area of the dining kitchen and outdoor patio, and then stepping up another 18 inches to the atrium, which you can see from the plan is slightly oblique on all sides to tear it really out of the fabric of the house. In order to reinforce that separation a little bit, the tile work in the room is given a cardinal orientation, which is different than the way the streets are in that area. Second level, a pair of stairways squeezed by the atrium. There's a major stairway, a broad stair runs to the front with a master bedroom and bathroom, and then a minor stair, very steep and narrowing, to the back of the house where there was originally a study, now a bedroom, and then the second large bedroom. A gallery connects on that level, which essentially acts as a library. On the roof, a square is dropped down into the house, flattening the roof, and essentially acting like a raft in the middle of this wave. Access from the outside only, with a hot tub, and then the skylight indicating where the roof membrane is peeled away, exposing the rafters and purlins below. This elevation, which I worked on for a long time, was quite happy with, until I realized that it was about 60 inches away from the next building. The atrium being made as a separate building with a separate a distinct surfacing and also massing to it, tears out of the house at that one corner, revealing itself on the outside. This is a stairway from the outside patio to the back bedroom and onto the roof deck. Since there is no view on the sides, the windows are kept high and essentially act as clear-story lighting, and the views really are all interior. The lot really it's a substandard lot, and the house is only 24 by 65 feet. Section through the atrium showing the buildings on that side, a wall peeled away from the master bedroom, indicating that relationship between this principal room and this, and then on the other hand, balancing the color and the separation between the public part of the house and then Lauren's studio, as happens between the public part in the middle and Laurie's studio. This wall being the same as that, the section is cut at a different point. Transverse section through the atrium, indicating the inhabitation by this quasi-building on one side. street elevation went through quite a lot of work, and the only reason it looks the way it is because we just had to stop working on it at certain points, and certain elements got fixed, others kept changing, finally got fixed. At this particular point, I was trying to talk them into setting the temporary power pole in concrete and leaving it unsuccessfully. These photographs were taken from the Caplin's bedroom. They happened to live right across the street from the construction site, which got them quite intimately involved in the construction process. And of course, you know, I had to go up to the bedroom every week or so, take more pictures. The roof was, for a while, Lauren kept calling the house high-tech. And I finally had to break the news to him. This is a plywood template that Ricky Klein is whacking away at, trying to get it roughly like the drawing I made. And after we got it laid out, we sent it off to a mill, and then they bandsawed these rafters out of 2x14s in gangs. And if that's high tech. You know, there were times in the process when I'm sure every architect goes through that you're absolutely certain you're in the middle of a giant architectural pratfall. We took the opportunity of being, both of us, you know, I lived about 3 blocks away and Caplin's was right across the street, to manipulate the house to a very large degree during the process. And I particularly appreciated that, since much of the formal content of the house to me is virtual and is not really well revealed in drawings and models, and only when you get in the space and see how the light and the forms are interrelating do you really know what you want to do. And so we did quite a bit of manipulation during the process, and I think it's to the carpenter's credit that he stayed with us as long as he did. In order for that roof structure to work on the inside, of course, all the insulation had to go on the outside. It's 2 inches of polyurethane sprayed in place over 2 layers of 3/8-inch plywood. These guys had a hell of a time staying on the roof. And the way they finally achieved it is, I thought, pretty interesting. Urethane sticks to urethane, and so you know, brand new tennis shoes, they sprayed their shoes with urethane, and then as they sprayed the roof, the stuff dries in an instant. They could then walk on it with their new urethane tennis shoes and not fall off. The facade, as well as a lot of other aspects of the house, really involve the concept of surrealism in general, and in specifically the concept of collage, and developed out of synthetic cubism in the early teens of this century. The construction process itself is well, architecture in general, I think, is an inherently surrealistic media, in that you're putting together a vast array of radically incoherent parts. And architects always have a difficult time when they try and make an abstraction out of this, something that's equal top, bottom, side, and perhaps white. And when you're putting flashing studs, nails, tile, tar paper, bathroom fixtures, and all this together, it really seems to me more authentic to treat it really as a collage. The Caplins have had a great deal of difficulty with this facade, and I've had to, at times, physically restrain Laurie from ripping that bib off over the door. I think there's about 12 different kinds of windows on that facade. Essentially broken into two types. There are, there are capital W windows, which are conventional archetypal forms. We all know what a window is. It's a certain size, shape, and proportion. It's cut up in a certain way, and it's made of certain materials. And then there are the abstract peels or slices through the building, which essentially are not windows. These elements here, and at the top, but really just places where the stucco's been ripped away and the earlier history of the construction is exposed. The entrance to a simple stucco building is aggrandized a bit by some glazed tile, which also then backs up an outdoor shower, since this is really a beach house. While the San Juan side is essentially a two-dimensional collage that has elements that punch in or that punch out from it, but essentially from a two-dimensional base, the Westminster side is a three-dimensional with three-dimensional facade with a whole section cut back, popped out, cut back again. The house is jammed right up against the property line with barely a walkway to allow you to get into the small patio area, entering into the middle of the house. This seems to be the way the house is used rather than the formal entry. The stairs then leaving that patio area and going up first to the back bedroom and then finally to the roof deck. The color of that stairway was picked off from a flowering tree next door. The roof deck being like this raft with the wave washing by it. entering from the front door, you move into the formal hallway and get the first indication of the hierarchy of the house. The slab on grade is stained red, stepping up to this first tile platform, which is the hallway, dining, kitchen area, and then finally to the higher level, the atrium. The atrium, being a different color, texture, and wall thickness, juts, protrudes, and squeezes into this hallway. On the other side, between the kitchen dining area and the atrium, the walls, these two walls, being part of one building, tear away from this one on this side, with this just the wood bridge stretched between the two. Same wall as seen from the atrium side. So you're standing in the atrium surrounded by these 4 abstracted pink buildings. What are you laughing at? Above the atrium is the skylight. The purlins are allowed to run through the skylight on each side in order to fragment the light a bit. The glass on the top is obscured glass, giving only light giving only diffuse light, no direct light. And then the end panel is clear glass, which allows for the direct light patterns. This is the boundary of the roof deck, which is a square. And at this point, you can see the obliqueness of the wall of the atrium below, which that beam sits on and supports the roof deck. The pair of stairs, the major general stairs to the right and the minor steep stairs to the left. They haven't realized yet, I don't think they're in Europe now, they haven't realized yet that they can't put a painting on that wall. I mean, I had a window on that wall that looked out to the neighboring building, and I thought that the view of the building, which is 5 feet away, would be the painting, because it would be fixed, and only the light during the day would change, and you'd see this kind of semi-abstraction there. And they thought, okay, come on, let's be serious now. We got to have a space for a big painting. So we filled in that window. They still can't hang a painting there. The master bedroom is populated mainly by this aircraft carrier and the flue from the chimney below, from the fireplace below. A very late addition was this bay. Laurie was very fond of intimate spaces where one within a large house can retreat to, and hence the ingle nook next to the fireplace, the small balcony reading seats off the upstairs gallery and this bay window in the front. And there was nothing really to support it by the time we got to this point, and so the whole thing is hung off a lintel above that door. The windows, there's a lot of interior windows that were carved in as the construction went, in that to get as much mileage as possible out of the light. Once the light is brought into the building, we pay a terrific premium in terms of insulation to have openings on the outside. And so the light is forced to bleed from space to space to maximize and also to enlarge the view from one room to another. This is the master bathroom. I've been waiting to do a collage of bathroom fixtures for a long time, having in mind Duchamp's ready-made called The Fountain. What's so funny? Haven't you people ever heard of Wet Magazine? This is connoisseur bathing. This is the what was to be an open study off the atrium with the arrival of Ilya. It was glassed in and made into an entirely enclosed room. And then this is the back bedroom and library. In addition to other business activities, Lauren is a composer, and this is his studio on the ground level at the San Juan side. No views, so the doors are glazed in order to allow him view into the small patio and then clear story lighting. Just a recalling to reestablish the character of the atrium. I wanted to show a couple of slides. Howard, you out there, boy? I got a bone to pick with you. There's two things that I've heard a lot of that really bug me. One is Coy made a comment in his lecture that reminded me of Max Ernst's iron with this kind of iron with tacks in the bottom. And I can't remember what the comment was. Something like, and I don't know, maybe if you remember, you can tell me. It was something like handsome but evasive, funky but chic, or whatever. I don't know. The implication being that somehow my work was slightly lacking in accommodation. The other thing that really gets to me is the great concern that is somehow around for inordinate publicity. So I think the last set of slides, I hope will put both those notions to rest. I mean, does that guy look comfortable? I mean, Coy told me this room couldn't be furnished. And look, I mean, it's furnished. I mean, it's jam full of furniture. Publicity? You want publicity? What publicity? Okay, keep your eye on this guy. This guy in the blue shirt. He gets paid to do this, by the way. Okay. I mean, obviously, this is a great place to meet cute girls. You know, intimate seating area. little, you know, casual conversation in the kitchen. He's not an actor, by the way. He's just a stand-in. They focus the camera on him. Want to relax? I mean, if you think the furniture is comfortable, wait till you try the architecture. Caplins are not sure about the new furniture. And look at all those people, obviously having a great time. Look at those smiles, comfortable, accommodated. Thank you very much.